Hi, and thank you for joining me here on Worlds Beyond. My name's Steve and I've been involved in the study of UFOs for near on 50 years, and I've created this channel to look back at both classic cases and some lesser known ones. I'm certainly going to avoid those kind of cases that have popped up on YouTube over the years with fake CGI footage. Remember when they used to say the camera never lies? Well, it does, and invariably there's an app for it. My personal journey began when I was about 6 years old and became fascinated in the subject after finding a magazine and my dad's in his toolbox showing pictures of discs in the sky and a scary pic that I later found out to be the flat woods monster. The rest is history. So stick with me for these mini documentaries and soon to come live streams and delve into the mysteries of the worlds beyond. April the 24th, 1964. I had recently turned 2 years old. Doctor Who was halfway through the Keys of Mariners story. The Beatles were number 1 in the States with Can't Buy Me Love. They were also at number 2 and 3 with Twist and Shout and Do You Want to Know a Secret? Also, strange things were afoot in Socorro, New Mexico. Now, before I go into any form of detail, here's a brief outline of the case for anyone who isn't familiar with it. Late afternoon, early evening on April the 24th, 1964, Sergeant Lonnie Zamora was chasing a speeding car when he saw what looked to be an explosion on the edge of town. Thinking a small dynamite shack may have somehow exploded, he discontinued the pursuit of the speeding car and made his way to where he saw the explosion. Once arriving, he navigated his police car up a rough embankment along a narrow gravel road that ran alongside a dry gully. At first he thought he saw what looked to be an overturned car and radioed over to police headquarters that he was going to check out the vehicle. At this point he saw what looked like 2 children or 2 small adults near the object. Moving further along the road, he stopped his car and heard loud thumps or slams. Getting out of his car, he walked towards the gully and got a proper view of what he initially thought was an overturned car. He could now see that it was in fact an elongated egg-shaped object that was resting on girder-like legs. Just then he heard a loud roar and saw blue flames shoot out from underneath the object, and the object began to rise off the ground. Thinking the object was about to explode, he hit the ground and then got up to jump down to the gravel road. He looked at the object and heard a whirring noise as the object was rising, and noticed that the legs he had previously seen were no longer noticeable on the object. Once the object had risen about 20 feet, the whirring stopped, the blue flame had disappeared, and he watched the now silent object move parallel to the terrain and then pick up speed as it went into the distance and disappeared from view. This brief overview was just the beginning of a 56-year-old mystery. As the show progresses, we will be looking at a number of things, such as what happened next, what agencies or groups were involved, the insignia mystery, theories and explanations. And we're also going to take a look at a very similar case. Remember, what I'm presenting to you is to wet the whistle, so to speak, pique an interest, so that you'll look into things a little bit more yourself. After the initial incident, Zamora recalled that as the object lifted up to then fly off into the distance, it narrowly missed the dynamite shack that initially thought to have exploded by only about 3 feet. On further investigation though, because of Zamora's actual position, it was more than likely that it was between 100 and 150 feet south of the shack, but that appeared closer due to Zamora's relative viewpoint. The object then picked up speed and headed off into the distance towards the 6 Mile Canyon mountain region. After the initial shock of all what's happened began to abate, he went straight to his patrol car and radioed back to police headquarters. The operator on the desk at that time was Nep Lopez. Lopez heard Zamora's breathless voice asking him to look out of the window to see if he could see anything. Unfortunately, Zamora forgot to tell Lopez to leave the radio room and actually look out of the south-facing window, so Lopez, instead, was looking out of the north-facing window and saw nothing. Lopez asked Zamora what it was he was looking for, and Zamora replied that it looked like a balloon, which was an accurate description of the ellipsoid-shaped object that was now disappearing into the distance. Yet even these events that frightened Officer Zamora so much, he was still able to draw an insignia that he saw on the object. We shall talk of this further on into the programme. Approximately only 1 minute and 50 seconds had elapsed from the moment that he first saw the flame that he believed to be the exploding shack to the object disappearing into the distance. As the object disappeared, Sergeant Sam Chavez arrived on the scene in his patrol car. Chavez was en route to Zamora after receiving a request to attend the scene via Nep Lopez from Zamora moments before he left the car to view the object. Zamora wanted another reliable witness, as he initially thought the object may be a secret research device, and Chavez was not only reliable but trustworthy and would also know which authorities to contact. Chavez later reported that Zamora, who had a dark complexion, looked as white as a sheet. He remarked to Zamora, "Lonnie, what's been going on? You look like you've seen the devil." Zamora replied, "Maybe I have." Chavez then began to examine the area and found a quadrangle of 4 imprints that were made by the object's landing gear. Also, there was smoke arising from an area of burning brush. On Tuesday the 28th of April, Socorro's bi-weekly newspaper, El Defensor Chieftain, carried a detailed account of Zamora's experience along with an accurate account of the imprints made by the landing gear. The article said, "They did not appear to have been made by an object striking the earth, but by an object of considerable weight, settling to earth at slow speed, and not moving after touching the ground." Zamora's radio transmissions to Chavez had been heard by State Police Senior Patrolman Ted V. Jordan. Jordan, accompanied by Socorro Under Sheriff James Lucky, arrived at the scene just minutes after Chavez. A cattle inspector named White also turned up after hearing Zamora's transmissions on his two-way radio. We have Jordan to thank for the photographs taken at the scene within a short time of the sighting. It was around this time that other agencies, the press and civilian groups began to get involved. Also, things get a little bit conflicted with different stories, so here I've tried to put together some form of timeline that makes sense, and apologise if it's different to how you've perceived this. Shortly after 6 PM, FBI agent J. Arthur Burns arrived at the site to find out what had happened. In the book Socorro Saucer, Ray Stanford mentioned that Burns was from Albuquerque but had been in the state police station at Socorro and had overheard Zamora's request for Chavez to go to the scene because, and quoting the FBI report, some unknown object had landed there. Burns also helped preserve the evidence by getting the officers to place large rocks around the indentations in the soil. In some books and magazines you will see pictures which will show these rocks around the indentations. Arriving back at the police station at around 7:05 PM, Burns left a message at White Sands Missile Base for Richard Holder, notifying him of a landed UFO in the Socorro area. Holder attempted to call him back, but the police station line was busy, so Holder, knowing he would have to go to the Socorro police station anyway, immediately drove there. Once meeting with Burns, he was introduced to Officer Zamora. It was during their interview with Zamora that they suggested he shouldn't mention seeing the 2 small figures, and, as I mentioned earlier, not to mention the insignia that he saw on the side of the object. The interview lasted about a half hour, then all parties involved headed back to the landing site. Burns drove in the same car as Captain Holder, and on the way picked up Sergeant Castle, NCOIC, that's non-commissioned officer in charge, who was from the military police, who was there to help in observations and measurements at the site. By the time they arrived at the site, Zamora was already there, accompanied by Socorro officers Bill Pyland and Melvin Ratzlav, who also aided in the investigations. Apart from the landing gear imprints, another 2 sets of imprints were found. The first set was 4 small round indentations, which was more likely from some type of ladder that possibly came from the object, and the other set, though less well defined, were described as being made by a person or persons with relatively small feet wearing shoes. When Burns, Holder and Zamora left the landing site later that night and returned to Chavez's office, they were immediately notified by Nep Lopez that 3 reports from 3 independent witnesses described a blue cone of light in the vicinity of the landing site a short time following Zamora's radio report of the incident. Holder filed this in his initial report and was there at Chavez's office completing the report until after 1 AM. For many years, UFO researchers had known of the FBI's involvement in UFOs, but in Captain Holder's official report of the Socorro incident, he added a footnote which stated, "Note, by request of Agent J. Arthur Burns Jr., please do not refer to the Federal Bureau of Investigation as participating in any fashion. Use of local law enforcement authorities is acceptable. On the morning of Saturday the 25th of April 1964, the news media were informed of the sighting, and within days reporters from the Associated Press and United Press International flocked to the town. The big players in ufology would also be on the scene. Jim and Coral Lorenzen from APRO, that's Aerial Phenomenon Research Organisation, arrived in the early hours of Sunday morning and were on site later that morning. Then, on Tuesday, J. Allen Hynek, astronomer and scientific advisor to the United States Air Force's Project Blue Book, who was still at that time quite a skeptic, arrived in Socorro, followed by Ray Stanford from NICAP, National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena. The sleepy town of Socorro was now buzzing with activity. Hynek soon realised that he was going to have to deal with a conflict of interests, those being the way the Air Force wanted the investigation to go and actually getting to the bottom of the truth. It seemed like the reputation of Blue Book and its handling of UFOs certainly preceded Hynek. Hynek stated that both Zamora and Chavez, quote, were very anti-Air Force, so much so Zamora at first wouldn't even speak to Hynek. Eventually though, Hynek was able to talk Zamora down, and it was after speaking to Zamora and seeing just how honest and personable a character he was that Hynek truly began to suspect that the military, the Pentagon and more than likely the whole US government were not at all interested in the truth behind the UFO phenomena. It was indeed a public relations exercise that didn't really want to bother engaging with the public, let alone share any real information with it. Hynek stated in his notes that the Air Force doesn't know what science is. The Air Force attempted to pass off Zamora's sighting as an experimental craft, even though there was no craft belonging to the military, private contractors on any manoeuvres on the day in question, and certainly nothing that fit the description. In fact, during Zamora's initial interview with FBI man Richard Holder, Zamora did state that he believed he had seen a secret experimental craft. Holder quickly dismissed this so much that he even said to the press that the military had no object that would compare to the object described by Officer Zamora. It was because of all he witnessed of the Air Force's handling of the landing in Socorro that Hynek would state, "I think this case may be the Rosetta Stone of UFO cases. There's never been a strong case with so unimpeachable a witness." And again, in the words of Hynek, the Air Force were in a bit of a spot over the apparent UFO landing at Socorro. From what I've presented so far, you can see there was much to this case, and it was in many ways groundbreaking. Let's quickly look at the controversy, or controversies, regarding the insignia that Zamora saw and what was presented to the public. I say quickly because the questions surrounding this could take up a whole show. Earlier in the show I mentioned that Zamora had made a sketch of an insignia he had seen on the side of the object as it was rising into the air. It's been said that the insignia that Zamora released was a decoy that came about after an agreement with Captain Holder. Holder reasoned that if anyone was to come forward as another witness, then if they produced a drawing of the real insignia, it would enable the investigation to tell if the new witness was indeed telling the truth. The insignia that was given out has been seen over the years is this one. Whilst this one is the symbol originally described by Zamora to his co-workers and to Captain Holder. Different descriptions by different people over the years have been given, but the second symbol is the one that Zamora originally described to people. Ever the patriot and honest man that he was, Lonnie Zamora kept his promise to Captain Holder up until he died in 2009. One final point on this, rumours about the insignia must have been doing the rounds with the media, as on the following day of the sighting, Saturday the 25th of April, Lonnie Zamora was interviewed in Socorro's KSRC radio station by Walter Schroed.
And did it have any kind of markings on it of any kind that you noticed?
Yes, it did. Not from that far I didn't see the markings. When I went up closer to it, I did see the markings.
And someone said that the markings that you saw was an upside down V with 3 lines running through it.
No, sir, I couldn't tell you that because they still don't want you to say nothing about the markings.
No, they don't want you to say anything about the markings. All right, we won't question you on that. And if we run into an area that they don't want you to talk about, well, you just say so.
It was also during this interview that Zamora, whilst actually stopping short of saying that it was something from outer space, made it absolutely clear that it was something he had not seen before. The 1964 Socorro case is one of my all-time favourite cases, but what exactly happened is still a mystery, and has had so many theories put forward over the years, so let's just have a look at a few. 1. Was it indeed an experimental craft, perhaps a lunar lander prototype that Zamora had seen? Richard Holder dismissed this as there was nothing that he believed was at the time available that would fit the description. You could argue the case of the blue flame being some form of rocket engine, and maybe the loud noise from the ignition may have deafened Zamora, so that he may have thought the craft was silent in its flight, when in fact he may have been temporarily deafened. Head of Blue Book, Captain Hector Quintanilla Jr., contacted known contractors who are working on lander technology for NASA, such as Bell Aerosystems, Douglas Missile and Space Systems, Goodyear Aerospace Corporation and Hughes Aircraft, who all answered in the negative to be testing anything in that area. Without anyone being able to say they had something in the area at that time, pretty much puts away the experimental lander theory. 2. A balloon. Some researchers said that Zamora had seen a balloon, weather or otherwise. Would that explain the loud roars and flames through a weather balloon? Not really. For a hot air balloon, possibly to some extent. You see flame from the heater and it makes one hell of a noise. But Zamora would have seen the basket type thing underneath. Zamora recalled that the wind had been blowing that day, so there should have been some residual marks showing something had been dragged along the floor. Also, when a balloon lifts off, it doesn't hover in one spot, especially if it was windy. The object was then seen heading in the west-southwest direction, which according to the weather reports for the day would mean the object was flying into the wind, and therefore not really the flight method of a balloon. Number 3. A hoax. As ever, in UFO sightings, even rarely well documented ones with excellent witnesses, the accusations of a hoax always raise their head. Astrophysicist, theoretical astronomer, alleged member of Majestic 12 and well-known UFO debunker Donald Menzel claimed that several high school students had set up this complex prank to trick Lonnie Zamora. When Hynek broached this with the locals in Socorro at the time, they thought the idea was absurd. You could guarantee that well-known UFO skeptic Philip Klass would leap out and declare hoax to anything at the drop of a hat. In this case, he tried it twice. Firstly, he wheeled out his favourite chestnut and stated that all Zamora had seen was in fact ball lightning. When it was scientifically proven that this in no way could have been an observation of ball lightning, he did what most debunkers do when the evidence is not in their favour. He mounted an attack on Zamora himself. Klass declared that Zamora was working hand in hand with the mayor of Socorro, Holm Burnsom Jr., and they had concocted this story in an attempt to put Socorro on the map. Klass claimed that the mayor actually owned the land where the incident took place and that it was to be a tourist attraction built there because of the UFO sighting. Both Zamora and Burnsom said Klass's claims were ridiculous. Well, Klass certainly was wrong. The tourist attraction never materialised, and the land where the incident took place, that didn't belong to the mayor either. More recently, a similar unsubstantiated claim has arisen that students from New Mexico Tech had pulled this prank. They apparently did this by having a large reflective helium balloon with a red insignia drawn on it, with added landing struts lay on the floor to look like it had landed. It would then be released on cue into the air. They would then throw flares and model rocket motors for the flames and roaring noises, and small students in white lab coats as aliens, and the area was also pre-dug for the landing indentations. Zamora was apparently lured there with the speeding car, and they knew he would break off chasing the car to investigate. Now, I don't know if you're aware of a British comedy show called The Goodies. They did a show where they had Graham Garden posing as Arthur C. Clarke, rationalising strange phenomena. The explanation of the Loch Ness Monster went a little like this. An extinct plesiosaur? I think not. What people are actually seeing is a common or garden rhinoceros floating upside down in the water, holding a French loaf in its mouth, balancing a tortoise on top. The Goodies' explanation for the Loch Ness Monster is comparably better than the explanation of the New Mexico Tech hoax. 4. After all that's preceded, we have to think that something strange did indeed happen. As to what is still a mystery. A TV station reported at 5:30 PM on the same day as the sighting from Lonnie Zamora that a resident from Albuquerque rang in to say that an oval-shaped object was flying low and slow towards Socorro. As news about the sighting spread, some more witnesses came out to say they had seen things. Opal Grinder, who managed a petrol station on Socorro's main north-south highway, said that he hadn't seen anything, but he did know of two men who had seen something. Grinder said the car pulled in just after the loud boom. One of the men commented on how low the aircraft fly around here. Grinder replied to say that helicopters around there often flew quite low, to which the man replied, "It was a funny looking helicopter, if that's what it was." Subsequent investigations revealed that the two men were Larry Kratzner and his friend Paul Keyes, who were passing through on their way back to Iowa. The two men were interviewed by UFO researcher Ralph DeGraw in 1978, and taking into account that the sighting was 14 years previous, there were some discrepancies against Zamorra's account and at the time each other's account, but there were some corroborative statements too. In the interview, Kratzner stated, "I saw a cloud of black smoke coming from the ground ahead of them and to the right. I could see a round saucer or egg-shaped object ascending vertically from the black smoke." He also claimed that he could see several windows on the side of the object and what to him looked like a red Z-shaped marking. There have also been some arguments over the semantics of the figures that Zamora said he saw. In some reports he said figures, others just white coveralls, others small adults or children. This is another part of the case which becomes long and drawn out, and it's also a researcher's nightmare. If it's niggling you or of interest, then please feel free to read through the official reports, interviews, books and associated documentation and reach your own conclusions. Eventually, the Air Force prepared 2 reports on the events regarding the landed object on April the 24th, 1964. The first, which was for the general public, shown errors throughout the investigation. If these errors were done on purpose, we'll never know. Because of these errors, inadequate documentation of witnesses and photographs, and the fact that some witnesses who came forward were never spoken to, the Air Force drew no conclusion from the report and it was left open. The second report, that was prepared by Quintanilla, wasn't seen by the public until many years later, and the tone of this report was definitely at odds with that of the original official report. In it, he stated there was no doubt that Zamora witnessed something that evening, and there was no question regarding the reliability of him as a witness. Interestingly enough, around noon on the 28th of April, about 76 miles from Socorro in Albuquerque, and only 4 days after the Zamora sighting, Sharon Stull, who at the time was 10 years old, and 8-year-old Robin Stull, saw what looked to be an egg-shaped object that was hovering close to their school, Lowell Elementary. Robin ran away, but Sharon remained watching the object bounce up and down in the sky before leaving. Sharon then received treatment for infrared burns on her face. The physician who treated her believed her story and furthermore believed the burns were caused by the UFO. On the very same day that Zamora sighted his object, but slightly earlier at 10 AM in Newark Valley, New York, farmer Gary Wilcox was out in his tractor tending to his crops when he noticed an egg-shaped object hovering slightly off the ground at the edge of his field. He drove over to it, got off his tractor and inspected it, even tapped on it and kicked it. It seemed to be smooth and polished, it was silent and gave off no heat of any sort. Then the story gets weird. From beneath the craft, 2 4-foot-tall men dressed in silver metallic suits appeared. They had a square tray with them with soiled leaves and roots on it. Both parties looked at each other for a few seconds when one of the humanoids said, "Don't be alarmed, we've spoken to people before." And from that point everything seemed to be a little muzzy to Wilcox. He couldn't say if he was being spoken to in English or if he was actually being spoken to at all. The beings questioned him on fertilisers and about farming in general. Wilcox asked if he could go in their craft, but they declined and said they would have to leave. Wilcox offered to get them a bag of fertiliser, but they said they couldn't wait. They entered the craft and it rose into the air making a noise like an idling car engine, and then it zoomed off into the distance, disappearing seconds later. Later on in the afternoon, Wilcox put the fertiliser next to the tree near the spot he had seen the craft. When he looked the next morning, the fertiliser had gone. Finally, I would like to add just one last case, and I feel this is very importantly connected to the Socorro landing. Close to Nice in the southwest of France lies the small village of Valençol. Recently, lavender plants had been stolen from a lavender farm, and at 5:45 AM Maurice Massey had been out checking his fields and was next to his tractor on his lavender field having a cigarette when he heard a whooshing sound and looked round to see a rugby ball shaped object about the size of a car stood on 4 legs by a nearby mound. He then noticed what he thought to be 2 children inspecting a lavender plant. Thinking these may be the culprits who'd been stealing his plants, he tried to sneak up on them. As he got closer, he realised they were not children but in fact strange beings. At about 15 feet from the object, one of the beings turned and pointed something at him that resembled a pencil. On doing this, Massey was frozen to the spot, unable to move. He could now see what the beings looked like. They were about 4 feet tall, wearing tight-fitting grey-green clothes, but there was nothing covering their heads, so he could see that their heads were pumpkin-shaped with large slanted eyes. For a mouth there was only a slit, and they had pointy chins and, strangely, normal-looking hands. Massey has already first to say what transpired between himself and the beings. After a while, the beings entered the object, the legs retracted, and it raised up into the air and flew silently off into the distance. It took a further 20 minutes for the paralysis to wear off, at which point he headed back to the town of Valençol. The owner of Le Café des Sports saw the appearance of Massey and was worried and asked if Massey was okay. Massey told him a little of what happened, and at that, the police were then informed. Why do I feel that this case is importantly connected to the Zamora Socorro case? Well, for one, it's very similar, but secondly, in 1965, French UFO researcher Aimé Michel interviewed Maurice Massey and shown him a drawing of the object the Zamora had seen a year previously. Massey then remarked, "Someone else has seen my UFO." See you next time on Worlds Beyond.